Okay. So it's been a decade since Lean In's Women in the Workplace report was first published. In the next session, Lean In Editor-in-Chief Caroline Fairchild is going to highlight key insights from the last 10 years of research. And then Edith is going to join her on stage so that together they can reflect on the progress made and talk about the next phase of change, which, as Caroline writes in the report this year, will require even more tenacity, creativity, and optimism. So please welcome to the stage, Caroline Fairchild.
Thank you, Erin. So I'm thrilled to be here with so many people in the room that I respect and admire so much, and to discuss the findings of our 10th anniversary report. So for those who aren't familiar with Lean In and McKinsey's study, this is the largest study of its kind on the state of women in corporate America. In the past decade, we've surveyed more than 1,000 companies and spoken to about close to 500,000 employees. And this year, we focused our survey on what's changed and what hasn't for women in corporate America. And what we found is that there really has been real progress, but it's surprisingly fragile. So what do we mean by that? Women have made meaningful gains across the pipeline, particularly in the C-suite. Women overall comprise 29% of C-suite roles today, compared to just 17% in 2015. But women of color remain vastly underrepresented, holding just 7% of C-suite roles compared to white women's 22%. And when we look lower down in the pipeline, it's not such a good story. Progress is much slower at the entry and manager levels. And women continue to experience what we call the broken rung, which is the promotion gap at that first step up to manager. So for every 100 men that are promoted to manager, just 81 women are. And as you can see, the numbers are far worse for Black women and Latinas. What may be the most concerning in this year's report is that the progress we are seeing in senior leadership is just not sustainable. The primary reason that women's representation has increased is that companies, on average, are adding about one staff role to the C-suite, and they're more likely to hire a woman into that role. And we want women at the table. We want women around every table, but we can't continue to add new staff roles to the C-suite indefinitely. So this is just not a viable path to parity. Indeed, our friends at LinkedIn recently came out with a report that found that from 2018 to 2023, the fastest growing job titles in the C-suite are all staff roles. So think chief legal officer, chief human resources officer. For a couple of years there, it was chief diversity officer. So despite progress, parity for all women is nearly 50 years away. At the current pace, it'll take 22 years for white women to reach parity, and more than twice as long for women of color. And by parity, we mean having the representation in senior leadership reflect their share of the US population. So what are companies doing to advance women? It's important to say that they're making important headway, but there's very critical work still to do. The good news is that employees do see meaningful progress, particularly when we look at women's opportunities for advancement, as well as inclusion efforts more broadly. But when it comes to handling microaggressions, these daily biases and barriers that women face every day in the workplace, they're saying there's still a lot more work to do. And perhaps not surprisingly, given their experiences, women of color see the least progress, and senior level men are the most optimistic about women's progress and the least aware of the ongoing barriers that women face. More companies offer training to promote inclusion, and we want to celebrate that, whether that's bias training, allyship training. But despite these efforts, employees just aren't showing up differently. They are no more likely to recognize microaggressions against women or consider themselves allies to women of color as they were about 5 years ago. And all of this is against a backdrop of declining commitment from companies to gender and racial diversity, while at the same time, employee commitment to these issues has remained relatively low. So where do we go from here? What do we do next? It's clear from our research that the next phase of work requires a bigger playbook. Kevin, I'm looking forward to your notes at the end of the conference. And so to discuss some of those solutions, I'm thrilled to be joined by Edith Cooper. All right, let's dive right in. I'm like, this timer is already ticking. So Edith, thank you so much for joining me. It's a pleasure, as always, and congratulations on your latest title as grandmother. Is that what you're going by?
Oh my goodness, we don't get handed anything these days. It used to be you have a grandchild, your grandma. Now I've got to do something cool, and I'm not inherently cool, so I'm working on that.
Well, it's your most important title yet, so let us know.
Get it right.
Get it right.
Get it right. No pressure.
No pressure. So a key finding of our report is that the progress that we are seeing it's fragile. And particularly when we look in the C-suite, it's unsustainable and unintentional. This is not companies' intended efforts to put more women into the C-suite. This is other things that are happening across the ecosystem that is leading to women's representation increasing. When you hear the word unintentional progress, what does that tell you about what's happening inside companies?
Well, I would say that there are organizations actually who are being quite intentional. And in fact, I think if you were to do a survey of companies as you do, and you were to ask decision makers at the top of the house, are you intentionally, they would go, absolutely, yes. This is a real important priority for us. But then if you ask the question with a subtext, which is, and have you been consistent on that focus over the course of up market times and down market times, there'd be a pause and we have business priorities here. And I think that is what's going to be really critical going forward, to ensure that we have representation of women and underrepresented groups at every level of an organization. You have to be consistently intentional, not only with respect to the development responsibilities that organization have to these groups, but also the system of an organization, the culture, which is often recognized as something that's super important and powerful, presents challenges for people who are not part of the majority. So let's focus on intentional development opportunities, but let's not forget that those individuals are operating in a system that historically has not been as, let's just say, welcoming and supportive to change across the board.
You mentioned intentionality, you mentioned consistency. I know that one of Medley's pillars is inclusive leadership, which you say requires both intentionality and consistency. What does that focus really look like to you? Does it, we speak a lot about turning DE&I, advancing women more broadly, into a business strategy, into a business need. What have you seen on the ground that works?
So just for everyone's reference, Medley is a company that I founded with my daughter, Jordan Taylor, and we focus on creating communities, working with companies who have a commitment to developing their people, have a defined learning and development strategy, and recognize that investment in their humans, in their leaders, in their managers specifically, is not a passing idea. It is a new way of really investing in developing the way that your managers interact with their people. A comment was made earlier about you have to know yourself before you can really lead others. Lead yourself before leading others. And that's what Medley does. I would say that the thing that's most exciting for us and for the moment that we're in is that people are recognizing that human skills are complicated. They are not soft, they are not passing, they are critical to the economic benefit and impact of any organization. So what we're seeing is that people are really investing in understanding what it means to be a manager, supporting that with investment in things like Medley and other kinds of platforms for learning and development, but also holding the organizations they're working with and their people accountable to show impact. Because that's how things are sustainable. Things are sustainable when there's a direct linkage between investing and developing your people, particularly women and underrepresented populations more broadly, to tie that to excellence in an organization. And I think that linkage sometimes gets lost.
I'm so glad you mentioned managers. Let's talk a little bit about them. They're on the front lines of the employee experience, and we know from data from our report that the laundry list of things that managers are expected to do in the workplace is just getting longer and longer. Over the pandemic, there was an increase in employee well-being, rightfully so, and inclusion. And employees are saying, yes, my manager is doing better at that, but when it comes to career advancement, that's something that managers are thinking less about, particularly women and women of color are saying that through our report. How can companies set up managers for success? Has anyone in the room figured this $1 million question out? There's so much for them to do. You're asking for them to treat their employees as humans, which they need to be doing, but also for the most ambitious, help them climb the corporate ladder. So how can you do those both effectively, given the constraints of their time and their resources?
Well, I think first of all, it goes back to connecting the dots, and I'm looking to learn a lot more from the playbook on what do we need to do to help managers be more impactful. We have to have a commitment and an understanding up front that giving managers the tools to actually effectively manage and learn how to manage is actually one of the most commercial and economically impactful things you can do. You know, back in the day when I worked at a very large financial institution, we all spent a lot of time talking about culture and value and managers, and everyone would get all excited about it. But I found with my colleagues in HR that we were having a hard time getting people to do it. Because at the end of the day, when people sat down for their reviews, did we talk about it? When we talked about their performance, did we mention it? Was there any inkling to the organization from a data perspective that having a good manager actually was one of the most leverageable skills and investments you could have? And the answer to a lot of those questions was, well, I don't know. Asking questions is really important. So we worked with our data, engineers and people in risk management, actually, who were the prime engineers at Goldman Sachs at the time. And she said, help us answer this question. Does having a good manager matter? And people who actually I had the good fortune of working with in the room are nodding their head here, because we actually showed that it did matter, that you were far more likely to be a strong performer if you actually worked for a strong manager. So think about the leverage that gives an organization. It's entirely connected to the performance of an organization. So when the CEO has all these things on their mind and they're using us to be their counselor, and they're trying to figure it out and we're trying to get their message tight, let's just focus on excellence. Let's focus on the responsibility of a CEO and all leaders and managers to take steps to increase the probability of continued progress, growth, impact for all the constituencies. And one of the ways to do that is investing in your people and investing in managers. It'll make a disproportionate impact, I would say, and we know based upon the work that you've done, on people who are not part of the center of gravity of management and leadership in the organization.
Absolutely. So you've told me that Medley's partners are interested in investing more in this issue, but our report shows that commitment to both gender and racial equity across the ecosystem is actually declining. What are you seeing on the ground in terms of top performing companies? How are they continuing their investments in DE&I, particularly amid the backlash that we're seeing?
Well, one of the most disturbing questions that I get is from people who have committed themselves to the practice of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. And most of it is concerned about backlash. Much of it is a conversation around choice of words. And people really stretching their brains to figure out, what do we call it? Because people don't want to talk about diversity. And my response is always, I gotcha. Excellence. Let's just focus on excellence. Because if you don't have excellent people, you don't have a company that's going to be relevant over time. And you get to decide. But do you really get to decide, as a company? Because people will be looking at you as an organization. And one of the things that they're going to think about is, are you going to be relevant to me? And if you're willing to cut out half of actually, I think it's 60% of people who are graduating from college right now are women.
58% maybe, yeah.
Yeah, 58%. But even for those who are not having the opportunity to go to university, who are working in important jobs for our economy, are you willing to say, we don't really, we'll just take what's left, these other populations. I don't think that that's a smart business decision. And so are there companies, perhaps, not that I spend a lot of time with, who are now really perplexed about should they, could they, they're afraid of, I will tell you the companies that we engage with, that I am personally engaged with, from the top of the house to the time I'm spending on boards, et cetera, really actually are doing the work. And the work is to create environments where everyone can really thrive. Because at the end of the day, whatever kind of organization you're in, Carolyn, I really believe, and leaders of those organizations believe, that to thrive and grow and continue to be innovative and important, you've got to have representation at every level. And they are committed to doing the work. Now, do organizations have all the answers? No, but I'm looking forward to the playbook, because I think one of the things that we really need to push ourselves on here is, what are the big ideas? Like, we can't keep recycling like the same things. We know sponsorship and mentorship is important. What does it look like? Let's get smart.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the environment. So women's day-to-day experiences in the workplace, they just by and large have not changed in the past decade. I sat around a virtual table with my colleagues, both at Lean In and McKinsey, and we looked at all of the survey data points that we had over the last decade around women's day-to-day experiences, and it was a bunch of flat lines. And this is mostly what we saw, no matter how we cut the data. So this is, in fact, an area where we're seeing the least progress in the report, is what women are actually experiencing on the ground in their companies. So we think about, the highest levels of the C-suite, these policies, these actions, these memos that come down from down on high. We've spoken a little bit about the role of managers, but how do we turn this into real change on the ground so women, particularly women of color who are having the worst experiences, are having a better day-to-day life within corporate America?
Well, what I'm going to say sounds simple, and I know it's really hard. I think that we all have to pay attention, right? When you look in the room and you are, do you pay attention to the fact that in your team of 10, there's one woman, or there's one person of color, one woman of color? And do you appreciate and notice that experience might be different? See, it sounds so logical to me. But it's not actually, I think, top of mind for many in the majority. Now, how does that manifest itself in the way that you action? Well, who's talking a lot? Who's not talking a lot? How are you listening to the woman in the room, or the women in the room versus the men in the room? I pay attention to it as a woman of color. If I'm in a meeting, I pay attention to how I'm interacting with another woman of color versus a white man. I pay attention to it because I'm going to be more familiar. We're going to have inside jokes. It's going to be great. We're going to bond. But I kind of pay attention to the fact that I don't know what this person over here is thinking, because I actually haven't interacted with them at all. And so if I can pay attention to it, because I know that it really matters, I think we all have to pay attention to it. And it's really difficult. When I read that in the report, that was one of the most disturbing things. And I said to myself, that can't be true. And then I recall 3 months ago, I was sitting with a group of really extraordinary people at a private equity firm. And the conversation went into whether you wear high heels or not at a client meeting. And I was like, this is absurd. Why are we talking about this? This is 2024. And then I realized that I took an extra half an hour deciding what I was going to wear to this private equity firm. So, it does matter, and it does take work. But I would say that it's really important that we understand that this is where having medleys really matters. It has medleys matter when you can look around and see other women, and you can interact with men who interact with you in the same, but perhaps differently than they interact with men. That you can find strength and the inner confidence that's really required to be extraordinary. That's why the communities, the convening that Charter has pulled together is super important, because we can say, oh my gosh, this is still top of mind of people. What are we going to do about it? And then we have to do something about it.
Such great advice. Our call to action in this year's report is for corporate America to just stay committed and keep going. We're very much in the messy middle of this journey to advance women in the workplace. Over the last decade, our data show that women have remained ambitious, committed to their jobs. But as Edith and I were just talking about off stage, this is not about changing women. This is about changing the systems in place that are supporting them. We need companies to stay ambitious and committed to this important work. As we think about that work that companies have ahead of them, let's just say for the next decade, Edith, what needs to change about that commitment?
I think it has to be, I'm sorry, I'm going to repeat myself here a little bit. It has to be consistent. It can't be an up market, down market phenomenon where we all care, we're reactive to an event that really like strikes a chord, and then we move on when that isn't top of mind anymore. We react to a toxic, article that someone writes, and we get all rattled and we're confused, and this isn't a time to be confused. This is a time to recognize that excellence is going to only occur if you create environments where everyone can really thrive. And if you're looking around your inner group at any level, whether you're a middle manager or you're a CEO, and you see a lot of the same, you've got to really start to believe deeply that you are not optimizing your organization for success. And that is what's going to happen. Now, it also requires us all as part of the communities to be resilient. And I often, found myself thinking, and I work with my daughter who's of a different generation, where, I'm just like, okay, like if it's hard, game on, let's go. And she's like, that's horrible. We shouldn't live in an environment where we feel, and there's truth to that, actually. There's truth because the generations that are, the many generations post me, are not really interested in shaping themselves into something that they're not.
Right.
And but on the other hand, I think it's really important to know that, like, you control you, and it's really important to create frameworks in organizations where when someone does talk over you or say what she's trying to say is, or disregards you entirely, that you're like, game on. It's hard to be that resilient. Absolutely. But it's going to require that.
Well, Edith, the data does show that if you are transparent with employees about how hard this work is, you get better results. So game on, everyone. Thank you, Edith. Thank you.